Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'll try to demystify what REST APIs are in more practical terms rather than the technical terms. So let's get started. In my personal view, the REST API is just two things. First of all, it's all about data rather than HTML pages. Second, if we are talking about the same resource, it should have same URL as well. Now look at these two statements in detail. When I say it's all about data, what do I mean by that? Well, if we look at our non-REST style of client-server communication, a client or front end sends a request to our backend or web server to, let's say, get a report for some city. Our web server in turn is going to talk to our database because database is where the actual data is stored. It's not our web server that stores the data. It's actually our database that stores the data. And we are basically talking to the backend server because only backend server can give us data and we are interested in data. When web server gets the data from the database table, what it does, it really doesn't send the data back to the client. It's going to encompass the data in a HTML code and send that HTML document to the client. So basically, server is taking the decision on behalf of front end that this is how it should appear in the browser, whereas this is not supposed to be the responsibility of our backend. That's supposed to be the job of front end. But because we are already getting data encompassed into HTML code, the browser doesn't have much to do, just render it and display it on the browser window. Now let's look at client-server communication in a RESTful style. Just like previously, the client sends a request for the weather of particular city. Server communicates to the database to get the data. And instead of sending the whole HTML document, server only sends the data. That is, the temperature for that particular city is 22 degrees. Now, since the front end has got just the data, we've got two advantages over here. Number one, the server has been relieved of the burden of sending it into some presentational document to the client. On the other hand, now the client has also the freedom to display this data just the way it wants to. It's not forced by the server to display in a certain order. So that's what I meant when I said it's all about data. The server only sends the data, not the presentational document as well. Now let's come to the second part. Same resource means same URL. In order to understand this statement, first of all, we have to understand what is a resource. As we just discussed, that sending a request to the server and getting the response from it is just all about getting the data that is stored in our database. So each row inside the table is actually a resource in the context of RESTful APIs. So resource is nothing but a row in a database table. Backend developers usually refer to it as model as well. Now, if the data comes from a database table, what kind of operations can we perform on them? Well, we can request to get all the resources or all the rows from the database table, or we can request a specific row or resource based on certain criteria, such as ID. We can add a new row in the table. We can update some data already present in one of the rows, or we can delete a specific row. So these are all the different types of operations that we can perform on database tables. And those operations are collectively called CRUD functionality. You are creating a new row, you are reading data of a particular row or all of the rows, you are updating some of the rows, or you are deleting some of the rows. So if we look at the example of our weather database, the temperature that is stored in the database table is our data. So when a browser or front end requests to read the data or read the resource, we are performing read operation. If your front end gives you this capability to send data through the form and create new resource, you are actually performing create operation of CRUD. And if you can update weather data returned by the server, you are updating the resource. If you completely delete weather for a certain city, you are deleting that particular resource or that particular row. So such a resource can be said to have implemented CRUD functionality. Now let's try to understand how are all these functionalities actually implemented practically in non-RESTful style. Well, we usually have different files, each implementing a specific CRUD functionality. And if we want to utilize any of those functionalities, for each functionality we have a different URL. For example, if we are interested in specific cities data, our URL is something like example.com/cityweather.php. If we want to add new resource into our database, our URL is example.com/addnewcity.php. If we want to update one of those resources already present in the database, our URL is example.com/update.city. You get the picture. So even though we are targeting the same resource, we have different URLs. Well, that's not how REST works. What REST does, we usually have one URL endpoint, example.com/weather.php, and that file has different functions, each function implementing one of the CRUD functionalities. And this is what I meant when I said if the resource is same, the URL should be same as well. Now the question arises, if the URL is same, how can we let the server know which CRUD functionality we are interested in? I mean, after all, it's the same URL. How would the server distinguish between those different CRUD functionalities? Well, that's where HTTP method comes in. Now, HTTP methods play a very crucial role in RESTful APIs, even though they were already present before the REST style, but after the arrival of RESTful APIs on the scene, they have kind of become celebrities. So let's understand what gives HTTP methods the celebrity status. Well, if we are interested in getting the data for all the resources in the database table, we use this URL along with this get method. So this get plus this URL is an indication to the server that the client is interested in reading all the cities data. But we use same get method, same URL, but we attach a query string. That means we are interested in one specific resource, and that resource could be identified by, let's suppose, city name. Now, if we want to add new data or new resource in our database table, we will again use the same URL, but instead of HTTP get method, we will use the post method. So by looking at this post method, the web server will immediately know that the client has sent some data, and that data is sent through an HTTP body. Likewise, if client is interested in updating already present resource at the server side in the database table, we will use the same URL, but we will use one of these two HTTP methods, put or page. Now we use page when we want to update not all of the data, but let's say some of the columns in our row, while we will use put if we want to completely replace the current resource with a new resource. Likewise, if we are interested in deleting a certain resource, we will use again same resource but with delete HTTP method. So this method will inform the server that now the client wants a certain URL, a certain resource to be deleted. And now comes the acronym. As we know, REST means representational state transfer, but what the heck does it mean? Well, again, use our same example. So if you are talking about the temperature of city London, let's say the temperature is 22 degrees. So that 22 degrees is the current state of that resource. When the temperature changes from, let's suppose, 22 to 23 degrees, we will say the state of that resource has changed. Now the server's job is to inform the client that that's the current state of the resource. So there are many different ways. One way could be the server jots it down on the paper and mails it to the client. Send an SMS, another way. Or in more computer-oriented terms, we just encompass the data into JSON object format and send it over in HTTP response. That's another way. Now, these are all different representations through which that certain state is being represented. The state being 22 degrees. So 22 degrees is a state. If we note it down on the paper, this is one representation of the state. If we using our voice inform the client, that is another representation of the state. Our SMS is another representation, and our JSON object is another representation. So the idea is the state is not tied to how it is being represented to be transported to the client. Now comes the transfer part. So if you are sending a letter, our transfer mechanism is the postal service. If you are making a phone call, The telephone network is the transport mechanism. And if you are using JSON object, that JSON protocol is the transport mechanism. So that's why it's called representational state transfer. A state is being represented in any way you like and is being transferred from one place to another place. Okay, so that was my take what RESTful APIs are. I hope you liked it. And if you did, please like, subscribe, click on the bell icon and share. Thank you so much.